course, Netanyahu and his various allies in Washington opposed that agreement because ultimately their real goal has always been a war with Iran. And unfortunately, they had a friendly ear in the first Trump administration. He withdrew from that nuclear agreement. Iran soon, restarted, enriching uranium to bring themselves closer to a possible nuclear weapon, which our intelligence community still believes is a decision they have not made.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This interview is the first of a three-part series, Militarism at Home and Abroad, U.S. Domestic and Foreign Policy, and its Implications in the Middle East. Also this June, I'll be leading my 19th Solidarity Tour to Palestine, and in late September, early October, my fourth in the footsteps of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela tour to South Africa with an emphasis on its solidarity with Palestine. I want to say thank you to our co-sponsors, ICAD USA and the Presbyterian Church's Palestine Justice Network. Matt Duss is the Executive Vice President of the Center for International Policy, and also among other positions he's held, he served as Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. Matt, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Great to see you.
Yeah, it's always good to see you. Matt, we'll get granular. I want to just jump right into it. We're going to get
Sure, let's do it.
granular about some of the following in just a bit. But I want you to take a few minutes to give us the 5,000-foot analysis. Iran, Gaza, Venezuela, Mexico, Minneapolis, Portland, Greenland, and more. I mean, we're overwhelmed, right, with all that's happening. I've been calling it the politics of intentional chaos. What are your thoughts about the thread, if there is a thread, that's running through these disparate offenses by the current U.S. administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, thank you. And again, apologies to the audience for being late. So I think what we're seeing now, I mean, there's a number of terms for it. I mean, one phrase that keeps coming up is imperial boomerang, which is, the United States has acted with impunity and violence in so many places around the world, especially over the last 20 plus years, the global war on terror, the invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, using our militaries in other places, many of which we don't even know about because it's classified to kill and kidnap, suspected terrorists who have barely, if any, due process. And we've, trained up and mobilized a lot of troops, bought a lot of equipment, which has now migrated back to our own streets. And it's not new. We've seen this for years. I think this became very, very apparent, especially during the summer of 2020, the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, when people really noticed that our police forces have just become completely militarized. So this is a problem that predates and is even bigger than just Donald Trump. It's bigger than it predates this administration. And in many ways, what we see from this administration, it is the product of those previous years. I've often said that Donald Trump is not someone who is breaking the status quo. Donald Trump is a product of the status quo. And I think that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing perhaps not a natural progression. It is, I think, an acceleration of some trends in our politics, in our democracy, but I think that have been really, really hastened by the kind of the anti-Muslim discourse, the warmongering discourse, a very violent discourse that really rose up after September 11th, 2001. And now you see it's in an even fuller expression, which is as little care as the United States paid to international law and international norms in the past. Donald Trump has just zero time for it whatsoever. So, when we see the way he's acted last summer in Iran, bombing Iran, for a few days in support of the Israeli bombing campaign, with no, I think, no feasible international legal justification other than he just wanted to do it. Same thing with Venezuela, to send an invasion force in to essentially kidnap the leader of another sovereign country. One does not have to like Nicolas Maduro, as I expect none of your viewers do or should, to recognize that that was a really provocative and illegal act. And yet, the United States is under Trump is simply asserting its power to act with total impunity wherever it wants, especially in its own hemisphere. And that's roughly how Trump, I think, sees the global affairs generally. I mean, there a lot of people have talked about the era of great power competition. Um, Great power collusion is another word that comes up, especially with Trump, because he basically just seems to believe that powerful countries, by virtue of their enormous power, economic and military and otherwise, get to force others to do the things they want. It's essentially a kind of global mafia. That's how I would describe it. He believes the United States is the most important kind of crime family in the world and gets to do what it wants, especially in its own region. But he also recognizes that countries like Russia and China, and even to some extent Israel and the Middle East, by virtue of their military power, get to basically determine outcomes in these specific regions, even if ultimately he still believes that they need to do so in a global security order that's largely determined by the United States. Um, so I think the impunity with which he acts abroad and the impunity and violence with which his administration has acted here at home, I think there is a very, very, very close connection there.
You've indicated in some of your writing that the beginning with the Biden administration, maybe even before, but begin with the Biden administration with Gaza, and now with the Trump administration's adventurism around the world and at home, that this is, quote, the end of the rules-based order.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the rules-based order, I mean, let's be clear what we mean. It can mean different things to different people, but in a general sense, it's the order that was created largely with the support of the United States and the victors of World War II, to establish, a set of rules, a set of institutions, laws of war. There had been efforts to do this before World War II, but I think, the United States really stepped forward to really stand up organizations like the United Nations, economic institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, but just to use, coming out of World War II, where much of the rest of the world was devastated, destroyed, the United States came out enormously powerful. Or because of where we are located, we had, experienced very, very little physical attack. The United States was just in a position to exert enormous power and influence, and use that power to stand up a system based on the idea that countries should operate according to a set of rules. Now, of course, the United States naturally encoded its own interests in the design of that order. That should be no surprise. But I do think it's at least premised, and I think an admirable sense that we can engage internationally, multilaterally, country to country, in groups of countries, in a way that's positive sum. The idea that we can agree on a set of rules that might bind us from time to time, though of course the United States, as powerful it was very constrained very, very little. It always asserted the right to kind of read the rules and break the rules when it wanted to. um, but that order continued. It was dominated by the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union for several decades. And then, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States really stood tall. That was called the unipolar moment, the United States and its kind of neoliberal approach to economics, its basic economic theory,
Yeah.
democracy, liberal democracy. There was the era of the so-called end of history, named after an essay and then a book by the political philosopher Francis Fukuyama. But just the idea being like, listen, we've kind of figured out how to run society. We want liberal democracy, individual rights. We want free trade. We want low taxes and all these things. And this is the kind of model we're going to export / impose on the rest of the world. Um, and there was always a bit of hypocrisy in there, of course. I mean, the United States and its allies, especially in Europe, got a special deal out of it. They enjoyed special privileges, essentially by being part of the imperial core. And countries in the global south often didn't enjoy those privileges when they weren't, straight up victimized by those in the global north who benefited from them. But I think especially, several, kind of moments over the past few decades. One is, the end, the 9/11 attacks, when the United States really responded by just launching a global war, a global counterinsurgency that saw the most powerful country in the world simply asserting the right to violate some of the most basic norms of that order, like norms against torture, norms against invasion, norms against assassination, and just assert that we need to do this to keep ourselves safe. So therefore, we're just going to break these rules. And it's really hard to uphold an order when everyone can see that you are doing so with such an enormous double standard. Another was the 2008 financial crisis, which was largely driven by a bunch of, gambling CEOs who had gamed the system to create all kinds of, it gives one a headache to even try and explain, the details of that financial crisis. But it really showed that the United States, which dominated the global financial system, was could not, in the view of a lot of people around the world, could not be trusted to really run the global financial system anymore, because it had enabled these wealthy CEOs to game the system in a way that crashed economies and created enormous suffering in our own country and around the world. But I also think one last thing I'll say here is, Trump really damaged that system by asserting power as he did in his first administration. He's been much worse the second administration. But Joe Biden, I think, did a particular kind of damage because Joe Biden was such a kind of self-proclaimed adherent of this system.
Yeah.
Someone who really believed in the rules-based order. He talked about it all the time. His Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, talked about it all the time. And yet, when you saw what they were doing, especially when you compare their response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the Israeli war on Gaza, the hypocrisy and the double standard just could not have been starker. I mean, things that the Biden administration criticized and condemned and sanctioned Russia for doing in Ukraine, it basically said nothing and continued to support Israel. It was doing exactly the same thing in Gaza, just besieging communities, attacking civilians, denying food, humanitarian aid, medicine, water to civilian populations. I mean, this hypocrisy had always been clear to countries that were outside of the imperial core, but it just made it undeniable. And I think that's why, as I've said, Joe Biden was a kind of high priest of the church of the rules-based order, and therefore his, clear violation of it did more damage than perhaps even someone like Donald Trump could have done, because Trump is just a heretic and doesn't believe in it. Anyway, and one thing I'll say here is, a few weeks ago, some of your viewers probably saw this speech that was given by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at Davos, and I think that is very, very significant. Carney is someone who is very much of the system. He was a former central banker in Canada and head of the Bank of England. Very much a creature of the rules-based order, so-called. But his speech served as a kind of wake-up call to say, like, listen, there was always a bit of hypocrisy in this rules-based order, but we were benefiting from this hypocrisy. Those of us in the global North, Canada, Europe, especially Western Europe. But now it's time to tell the truth, because the global power in whom we had invested so much of our security, the United States, is essentially becoming a predator. That is my view. I mean, those are my words, not his. But he was saying, the story that was told about globalization is that we will kind of integrate with each other, our systems, we will cooperate, we will work together. But now we see the United States kind of weaponizing those relationships, weaponizing that interdependence in a way that he said that middle powers like Canada and others now need to work together to protect ourselves from this. But I do think, one of my kind of joking, cynical takeaways was just, it's a good confession from him, was that, up until now, we knew it was kind of a lie, but we were benefiting from the lie. So now it is time to tell the truth. And my view is like, yes, good. Let's tell the truth. Let's try to build a new and better global order based on that truth.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really worth a read, his speech at Davos, especially as he quotes Václav Havel,
Yeah.
and the story of the greengrocer and the sign in the window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, I want to get to the Middle East, but I want to ask you one more question just about global interests.
Hmm.
Just in terms of U.S. strategic interest, talk about how this has been weakened, how that's weakened us with the UN, NATO,
Hmm.
EU,
Hmm.
Canada. You mentioned Mark Carney, our traditional allies, and how it's strengthened Russia's interest and
Yes.
China's interest
Yes.
in the global South and around the world.
Right. I mean, it's really hard to overstate how much damage it's done to our interest and how it's benefited those two countries you named. I mean, first of all, the United States has enormous advantages just by our geographical position, right? We have two huge oceans on either side of us. We have friendly neighbors, or at least we did, to the north and south, um, who had no intention of being in conflict with us. Occasionally, they would take certain decisions on trade and economics or other things in which there was some tension, but there was always, a clear effort to. They understood that they had more to gain from working with us, and were quite willing to do that. And this is true, I think, of a lot of countries around the world. Is differences that they might have had with the United States. There was that double standard, those hypocrisies that arose from time to time. But at least there was a general sense that, from administration to administration, even though some will be more provocative, take steps we don't like, with like the George W. Bush administration, the global war on terror, the Iraq war, and other things like that, at least there is an enduring sense that the United States is engaged internationally in upholding an order that we can benefit from. Now, China has for a long time operated within that order. It has gone to countries with infrastructure aid and other forms of aid, and kind of made itself a more attractive partner than the United States, and those efforts have really been you know, helped by what Trump has been doing. Because, as I said, Trump is effectively saying that the United States is now just a power like any other great power. There is not even the kind of veneer of any principle, or any kind of positive sum engagement. The United States is just going to define its interest and coerce, either through economic and financial punishments or through violence when necessary, to advance those interests and extract what it needs, from friend and foe alike.
Let's let's talk about Palestine and Israel, Matt. 851 days since October 7th, 2023, and now Israel's genocide in Gaza and of course throughout the West Bank too. I I work closely with Jeff Halper and ICAD, Matt. Jeff's been talking that from even before October 7th, 2023, about Israel's and the U.S.'s agenda of normalization.
Mm-hmm.
That is normalizing peace. So Trump declares peace. The Gaza war is over. There's the board of peace. And
Mm-hmm.
Jeff's predicted that normalization signals the end of Palestinians because the world would have moved on. And so so he says we need to be naming it and fighting it in whatever ways we can. And just bear with me for a second. There are many layers to this process of
Mm-hmm.
normalization. The propaganda machines of Israel and the United States, buying off Arab countries and the Abraham
Mm-hmm.
Accords, especially the role of the complicit corporate mainstream media
Mm-hmm.
and others. So, just your thoughts about normalization and
Yeah.
Palestinians.
Right. Even from the the when the Abraham Accords were initially announced in summer of 2020, it was pretty clear that this was kind of a dream come true for Netanyahu, because it was a way to get around the Palestinian issue. I mean, for a long time, the argument had always been, Israel can build relationships and become a normal nation with relationships in the region. Um, um, but they have to kind of address the Palestinian issue first. And he always said that's not true, because he has always opposed a Palestinian state. He does not believe the Palestinians are entitled to self determination. He thinks it's just a problem for Israel to deal with internally. And he had a lot of allies, of course, in the Trump administration. Jared Kushner, then Ambassador to Israel David Friedman, who were just super pro Israel, pro settlement, anti Palestinian. And you also had the United Arab Emirates, that was really interested in the kind of goodies that would come, that were offered in terms of arms sales, in terms of influence in Washington, by doing this normalization with Israel. Now, it was promoted as peace. Of course, the United Arab Emirates was not at war with Israel. It was essentially, an agreement between two, undemocratic regimes, in a way that was sold to a lot of people in Washington as like, okay, this is a way to kind of advance Washington's enduring interest in the Middle East. I never saw it that way. Certainly, Palestinians were cut out of the process. They understood that this was just a way of keeping them repressed into the future. Unfortunately, the Biden administration came in and fairly quickly picked up on that logic and decided it wanted to advance and expand the Abraham Accords. They wasted a lot of time, and energy, and resources in trying to bring the Saudis into a normalization agreement, even after October 7th. Um,
Yeah.
and I would have hoped, and I wrote about this a number of times, um, that after October 7, the Biden administration really needed to kind of revisit its assumptions and its analysis, of the region. They didn't. Unfortunately, they essentially just doubled down. They backed, as everyone knows, they backed the Israelis unconditionally, in the massacre of Gazans in Palestine, and they continued to seek this normalization agreement, which it became clear was never going to happen in the absence of an Israeli kind of concession to or acknowledgement of the Palestinians' rights to a state, let alone a tangible move toward securing that state, which is still not going to happen. Which is why the Saudis have moved even farther away from such an agreement.
Let me ask you. You mentioned these alliances. So the president's ordered U.S. military buildup in the Gulf to prepare for a potential military action. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other countries have been on high alert, anticipating U.S. strike on Iran. The Israelis have been to D.C. to share intelligence on potential targets inside Iran, and the Saudis are concerned about a potential regional war. So, Matt, just for us here who don't follow these things maybe day by day by day,
Mm-hmm.
what's the current situation between the U.S. and Iran? And explain in more detail the U.S., Israeli, and Saudi connection vis-a-vis Iran.
Well, the Israelis, in particular, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has wanted to attack Iran for many years. He's been talking about the Iranian nuclear threat since the 1990s. President Barack Obama attempted to address the Iranian nuclear issue with an agreement that limited Iran's nuclear program, put it under heavy inspection and limitation, which would have prevented Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And lo and behold, of course, Netanyahu and his various allies in Washington opposed that agreement because ultimately their real goal has always been a war with Iran. And unfortunately, they had a friendly ear in the first Trump administration. He withdrew from that nuclear agreement. Iran soon, restarted, enriching uranium to bring themselves closer to a possible nuclear weapon, which our intelligence community still believes is a decision they have not made. Despite the fact that a lot of anti-Iran hawks in Washington talk about, oh, Iran is dead set on getting a nuclear weapon. In fact, that is not the case. Iran would like to keep the option open, to obtain a nuclear deterrent for issues for its own protection. That's our analysis. The intelligence community, if they have not made that decision yet, so there is time to help them make a different decision, which is what the nuclear agreement was all about. And then, of course, Joe Biden, after having promised to rejoin the nuclear agreement, broke that promise. And then Donald Trump came in. We saw, there were a number of moves taken during the Gaza war to weaken Iran's allies in the region, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and militias in Syria, and the Assad regime, excuse me, in Syria, which ultimately led Israel, seeing, Netanyahu thought that it was an opportune moment to launch an attack on Iran, hoping and expecting that Trump would follow on with the kinds of bombs that only the U.S. has to do damage to Iran's nuclear facilities, which Trump did when he bombed Iran for about 3 days last summer. Did not destroy Iran's nuclear program completely, despite Trump's claims. Iran does still have a considerable amount of highly enriched uranium, although much of it is believed to be buried under the rubble. But Iran clearly still does have the ability to restart a nuclear program and move toward a nuclear weapon if it chose to. So Trump didn't solve the problem. He simply kicked the can down the road. So right now we've got Netanyahu once again egging Trump on to attack Iran again. They were using the excuse of these protests, which have been ongoing in Iran, anti-government protests, really enormous. And we should acknowledge the courage of these protesters in the street who've been protesting against the Iranian government. Those protests now appear to have subsided because the Iranian government used enormous violence against the protesters. But of course, Netanyahu never really cares about Iranian protesters, nor does Trump. There's an effort, or was an effort, or I guess still is an effort to bring the U.S. and Iran together with other regional powers for talks that were supposed to begin, I guess, Friday. They were originally going to be in Istanbul. Then the Iranians at the last minute said, no, we want to move them to Oman. And basically what I've seen from just earlier today, now the future of those talks are in question, which could, ultimately lead Trump to deciding, okay, it's not worth it. I'm just going to go ahead and hit Iran again. But I think what is really driving this is, less about the nuclear program, and it's about Iran's ballistic missiles. I mean, has always been a key concern for the Israelis, is that Iran does have a pretty formidable arsenal of ballistic missiles. Many of them were damaged in the June attacks, but many of them were launched at Israel. And when I was in Israel in October, I saw some of the damage that they did in downtown Tel Aviv, and it's pretty extraordinary. I mean, I think a lot of it was not even reported because of censorship in Israel. But these missiles do serious damage, like destroying entire apartment blocks in residential areas. And the fact, and another thing we learned when we were there from Israeli analysts is that Iran was reconstituting its missile capability much quicker than many expected. So I think that is really what's driving the urgency here from an Israeli perspective, is they need Trump's help to kind of destroy a bunch of missiles again. Before they have to go back and do it again a few months down the road. And the last thing I'll say on this, which is so troubling, is, for years, there was an approach to Gaza, which they called mowing the lawn, a deeply offensive term. I mean, people are not blades of grass. But this was the kind of security approach used, was that, we're going to keep Gaza locked up, under control. Every once in a while, we'll see, Hamas doing something, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another militia faction, doing something we don't like. Maybe they launch a few rockets at us, and we need to go and bomb Gaza for a while to restore kind of our deterrence. And that's what they called mowing the lawn. Now, Israel seems to have applied this doctrine to the region as a whole. They bomb Lebanon whenever they want. They bomb Yemen when they want. They bomb Syria whenever they want. And now they're going to bomb Iran whenever they want. And it shouldn't shock anyone to hear that this is not ultimately going to be a sustainable strategy. We found out very, very horrifically on October 7th, 2023, that was not a sustainable strategy for Gaza. Unfortunately, rather than, kind of doing a real rethink about what is going to be a sustainable regional security architecture that includes self-determination for Palestinians, Israel, with the support of the Biden administration, basically just decided their approach was going to deploy enormous violence on as many people as possible.
Let me follow up that and the normalization question with, is the Trump and Netanyahu plan for Gaza, is that a fait accompli? I mean, where's the pushback? I don't want to say where's the hope, but is there obstacles that we can put in the way of the completion of the genocide in Gaza and holding it for Palestinians?
Mm. Well, I think, obviously continue to reach out to your members of Congress to press the Trump administration to explain what they are doing, to push back and criticize. I'm not going to say that is in any way a kind of master key to changing policy.
I'm from
it
Indiana.
is not.
I'm from Indiana, man. Okay.
Yeah. But perhaps others. I mean, unfortunately, we have to rely on, governments like the Saudis and others who are really, holding. I'm not going to say they're holding back the flood, because they're not, but continuing to press on the issue of Palestinian rights. I mean, I think the Saudis holding back from signing a normalization agreement um, in the absence of anything for the Palestinians is important. Unfortunately, the Europeans aren't really doing anything. They have enough problems with the U.S. under Donald Trump. I think ultimately what is going to happen is that Israel is simply not going to control Gaza. Gaza will continue to be a security problem for them in the absence of any Palestinian self-governance or self-determination. I think they have, the illusion that they can manage this status quo into the future, and they will, with enormous violence and suffering inflicted on Gaza's residents. They will, but I do think it's going to require a better U.S. administration if we ever get one. That is ultimately what's going to change this situation. And again, not that we can solve this problem, not that we can solve the problems within Palestine or within Israel, but I think it's only the U.S. can impose the costs on Israel that are absolutely necessary to begin to change the trajectory here.
Matt, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about Bernie Sanders. Now, I know
Mm.
you don't work for him anymore, but
Hmm.
you can kind of give us a peek behind the curtain. Here's this older Jewish man who's really been one of the more outspoken, at least people in the Senate, in support of the rights of Palestinians. He and AOC were on this fighting oligarchy tour,
Hmm.
and now he was one of the more prominent supporters of then candidate, now New York City Mayor
Hmm.
Zoran Mamdani. Give us an insight into the man, and give us an insight into his support for Palestinian rights.
Yeah, well, I think his support for Palestinian rights is just consistent with his support for human dignity for all people, human dignity and equality, rights under the law, just a basic sense that we have a shared humanity. This is something that undergirds so much of his work. That's something he talks about a lot. And he also understands that the United States has enormous responsibility here. We're Israel's biggest and most important security partner. We are the ones who have essentially ensured Israel's impunity over decades and decades of the occupation and their efforts to suppress Palestinian rights. Um, and he not only is it unjust, he also understands that it does not lead to better security for the United States or for Israelis or Palestinians. So I think all of those things are part of what guide his views here.
Uh, I'm just making a note here. His support for New York Mayor Zoran Mamdani really resonated. I mean, Bernie Sanders resonates not only with people my age, but with young people.
Hmm.
And Mamdani's message, I mean, he's a democratic socialist, and his message resonated with young Jews and with younger voters across the board. Is his and his criticism of Israel and all the rest. What do you think of Mamdani, and what do you think? Can his message resonate in other parts of the country too? Do you think? Are we at the point where we're ready to embrace?
Yeah. Well, I think it can because even though you don't want to kind of draw too many lessons for the rest of the country from the New York mayor's race, I think what's important about Mamdani's position on Palestine. I mean, first of all, let's note like he wasn't the one who made Palestine an issue. It was his critics who made it an issue, thinking that it would detract from, it would hurt him, and they were wrong. It ended up being a plus for him, not just because it reflected the views of so many voters in New York, especially younger voters, but it also showed that he's not full of crap. I mean, this was an issue where you're supposed to, oh, you can't say this, you can't say that. He took a really, in many ways, daring position. It shouldn't be daring to support equality in Israel and Palestine, but he took, in U.S. terms, particularly in New York political terms, a daring position of principle and stood by that position and defended it very capably in just explaining why his position was the right and the just one. And I think that really impressed people, even people who don't care about these issues, even people who perhaps disagree with him. They saw someone who was standing up for what he believes and explaining it in pretty straightforward terms. And I think that helped him not just with his supporters, but people who might have been skeptical because it showed like, okay, this guy is for real. This guy is a true, he's telling us what he really believes. And even if I'm not 100% with his program, I trust that he's gonna do what he's telling me. He's someone who believes in the rights of all people, and he's gonna try to make all of our lives better.
All the polls are telling us that an increasing number of young people and a significant number of young Jews reject U.S. support, its absolutist support for Israel.
Mm.
Yet our Congress, with some exceptions, they still seem to be in lockstep with Israel. Critics in Congress, like Cori Bush, we just hosted Cori Bush here, Matt,
Mm-hmm.
last November, and Jamal Bowman. They were
Yeah,
defeated last
yeah,
election. So,
yeah.
but on the other hand, we do see some movement toward at least holding Israel accountable for the billions we send them. We see Rashida Tlaib and Indiana's Andre Carson and others, and
Mm-hmm.
a growing number of Congresspeople.
Mm-hmm.
I used to just work with the grassroots and not worry about Congress so much and
Mm-hmm.
spend my time and energy with the grassroots. But I'm beginning to see a glimmer of hope in the political process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you've dealt with that in your professional life. Talk to us about, well, what insights, what's been your experience, and what insights do you have about, is there a glimmer of hope now in the political process with regard to holding Israel accountable?
I mean, I think there is. I mean, this debate has really been shifting again. I know Jamal Corey. I mean, great leaders who were taken out by pro-Israel money, which is a reflection not just of the issue, but it's a reflection of the corruption of our politics. The fact that a few very wealthy donors from outside people's districts can just dump tens of millions of dollars and swing an election is, I mean, there's no other word for that. That is political corruption. That's a problem on a whole range of issues in our politics, not just on Israel Palestine. But I think Mamdani is one example, but also I think if you look at a number of other candidates who over the past few months have been coming out, including someone like Gavin Newsom, who is very much an establishment Democrat, who said he will not take APAC money. I think that is a real sign of the times right there. When people feel like in order to have credibility with the Democratic base, they need to say outright, I will not be accepting money from the pro-Israel lobby. Now, it's, getting them elected is another step, and then making sure that they follow through on the implications of those promises is yet another challenge. But I do think, you do see some evidence that the wind has really changed on this.
Talk to us about the effectiveness of BDS. It used to be Hewlett Packard and Caterpillar and others. Now we've been focusing on Chevron and
Mm-hmm.
Palantir because of their surveillance and their
Mm-hmm.
IT involvement.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, how effective does BDS continue to be? Are there other forms of resistance or places of resistance that we in the activist movement can embrace?
I mean, choosing not to spend money or uniting against companies that are involved in repressive activities, I think, is entirely, just and reasonable, regardless of its efficacy. But I mean, there's acting individually on a moral basis. But again, this what BDS is about collective action
That's
in
right.
support of the Palestinians, and that's, I think, really important. I mean, it's hard to say that it has. I mean, if we look at the situation now, we look at the situation of the U.S. government, even under the Biden administration. It's unfortunately, and I say as someone who's been committed to this issue for a long time, we have to recognize that it didn't really impact Joe Biden's decision making or his administration's all that much. But I do think it's an important organizing tool. Even though I don't support or agree with every decision that the broader movement has made, I do think it's an important organizing tool as the movement prepares to mobilize behind a possibly better administration, to build support in Congress, um, and more broadly across civil society. Um, when there's a better opportunity.
Armed militias, identity cards, surveillance, arrest without cause, administrative detention, extrajudicial killing. It could be in Israel. It
Yeah,
could be in the United States, in one of
yeah.
our cities. The similarities and connections are not coincidence. ICE is trained by the IDF. What more about this interrelationship between Israel and U.S. Militarism do we need to know?
Well, I mean, first, yes, those relationships do exist. Those trainings have, does happen. I would be very hesitant to place too much of the focus here on the ICE IDF relationship. I mean, listen, the United States, we saw how US troops occupied various countries over the past 20 plus years. We've seen how US police have acted, especially in inner city communities. Um, completely apart from any relationship with the idea. So I really, I really don't want to overstate that relationship. The United States has a very, very long history of violence on its own communities, especially poor communities, especially Black and Brown communities, that long predate even the existence of the state of Israel. So I probably wouldn't emphasize that too much.
I'm aware of the time, and I promised that you'd be out of here by 2 o'clock because I know you have another commitment, Matt.
Yeah,
Where do you see resistance to authoritarianism today in the U.S. and in Israel and Palestine and other countries?
yeah. I mean, in the US, I mean, look to Minnesota. I mean, Trump just announced today that he's withdrawing hundreds of federal officers from Minnesota. That's clearly a success by communities in Minnesota that have been resisting the ICE crackdown, that have been, communicating with each other, that have been helping their neighbors, both with shelter and with food, that have been warning their neighbors, that have been confronting these kind of lawless activities, both by filming, by sounding the alarm. And unfortunately, two of our fellow citizens were murdered in cold blood in full view of the world, as we saw. And I wish it wouldn't have taken that to really raise the political costs for Trump, as they clearly have been raised, because he is operating first. He withdrew. He withdrew the commander Bovino, of the Border Patrol from Minneapolis last week, and now he's set to redeploy a lot of these officers. But I think that's one example. I really hope it won't take the murder of other people in other communities, um, um, to see future successes. Now, in Israel and Palestine, I think that the kind of joint struggle, the efforts we see in communities like Masafer Yatta and others in the West Bank, again, under really horrible conditions. The settlers are acting in total cooperation with the Israeli military. The settlers aren't just supported by the government; they are the government in Israel right now. But I do think you see a lot of Jewish Israelis who get themselves physically to the West Bank to support Palestinian communities. Um, and again, this work is frustrating, especially in this moment. But I do think those relationships and those networks are important, when there's an opportunity in the future for a better policy.
How that happened? Where do you find the pushback against Israel internationally? I mean, where can we? Are there NGOs that we need to be more supportive of? We're here connected with Peel Palestine and a number of
Hmm.
other folks, but UNRWA was just removed,
Hmm.
from
Yeah,
their facilities destroyed in East
yeah,
Jerusalem, been
yeah.
sidelined. Talk to us about where the resistance is to Israel and Palestine internationally.
Well, I know. I mean, the Palestinians themselves, of course, groups like Al Haq, and others, that have been doing work in Palestine, to document abuses, um, to give support to activists. There's people may know the name Isa Amro, who's runs an organization called Youth Against Settlement. He's based in Hebron. I mean, this man is an absolute hero. I mean, in my view, his name should be mentioned alongside Desmond Tutu, who's he's someone who has really been doing, very, very difficult work, to resist the occupation in Hebron, which is one of the places the occupation lands the hardest. Um, those are just two names I can mention. Another is 972, which is a website that does joint reporting from Israelis and Palestinians, which has really broken a lot of very, very important news, done exposés on the Israeli military operations in all of the occupied territories.
One last question, Matt, and then I'm going to let you kind of give your final thoughts.
Yeah.
But what advice do you have for activists here in the U.S., for those of us who are in the movement,
Yeah.
especially those of us committed to nonviolent activism?
Yeah, I mean, the one is obviously educate yourself as much as you can about the realities of the situation so that you can explain and persuade when possible others, Americans, help them understand how implicated every American is in this situation because of the tens upon tens of billions of dollars that the United States continues to provide to this conflict, to this occupation, to this repression, to this apartheid, and to supporting this genocide. I think making, reaching out, using every tool you can to reach out to your members of Congress, to kind of let them know that this is a growing movement in the United States, and that the political winds have shifted here.
Thanks, Matt. I want to give Matt the last word, but before I do want to say thanks again to our co-sponsors, ICAD USA and the Presbyterian Palestine Justice Network. And by the way, Matt, before I go on, I'm on the board of Friends of Hebron with Issa Amro, and we met
Oh,
last
wonderful.
week, and we're going to meet in another couple of weeks. He was supposed to come again this
Mm,
year for another U.S. tour, and because of the visa situation and the Trump administration blocking Palestinians, he's not able to come. But we had him here in Fort Wayne just this last year. And please, if you're interested in either of our upcoming tours, the June Solidarity Tour to Palestine, or late September, early October in the footsteps of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, with an emphasis on South Africa's solidarity with Palestine, please email me. Thank you for joining us today. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
no, thank you again for having me. And again, I think it's just organizations like this that are really important for as citizens to remain engaged and to share knowledge, and to support, and just and just again just to stay aware of what our government is doing in our name.
How can we connect with or get the resources of the Center for International Policies? You want to give a
Yeah,
free commercial about what you
sure. Yeah,
do
just
and
internationalpolicy.org is our website. You can check that out. You can follow me on X at Matt Duss. I'm often sharing materials that our fellows and researchers are putting out. So again, thank you.
thanks, Matt. Take care now, and
All
thank you
right.
everybody for joining us. Hope to see you next week. Thank you. Bye now.